All right. So, yes, so please make sure that you have it on your calendar. First midterm exam is on March 2nd. Okay. And it will be on the blackboard at the same time that your class starts. Now, this chapter is on the structure of uh, proteins, and this is the first part. Um, you've been the last few classes, we learned about um, amino acids and pKa's and peptides, and now we are going to talk about proteins. Okay, so here is what we are going to learn. um, I alluded to this in the previous classes, that there are four weak and non-covalent interactions that stabilize protein structure. Please mute yourself. I know some of you are not muted at this time. I'm hearing it. And we will talk about that, and we'll also discuss what roles amino acid sequence, the primary structure, play in the overall structure of a protein. Then we will discuss briefly the secondary structure, which are alpha helix, beta sheets, and turns, etc., and how they are formed, and how the elements of the secondary structures come together to form a globular three-dimensional structure of a protein. And we'll also talk about the final higher level structure, which is the quaternary structure. If you recall, I have been showing you the structure of hemoglobin, and that's a classic example of a quaternary structures where four individual polypeptides come together and form a functional protein. So protein function is directly related to the structure of the protein. And the structure of the protein, as you will see, depends on the sequence of the protein. So the primary structure and those four weak non-covalent forces. Okay. It turns out that the number of, if you look at the protein structures, so far, hundreds of thousands of protein structures have been solved. And if you look at the structure of all these proteins, you will notice that protein folding pattern is large, but it's not infinite. Okay, so all of the proteins tend to fold in one type or the other folding patterns that are already known to exist. Okay, so let's say you isolated a new protein and you are actually you spend time cloning and expressing this protein in your lab, and you determine the structure of the protein using X-ray crystallography. And when you look at the tertiary structure of the protein, you will see that folding patterns might be similar to some other structures that have already been solved. And so globular proteins are marginally stable. Their stability is marginal, and that is important for the function of the proteins oftentimes, because the marginal stability allows the protein amino acids of the proteins to move around. Okay, they can facilitate motion, and motion is often needed for the function of the protein. Okay, so many times you have an enzyme, and as enzyme is actually carrying out the catalysis, you will see that a loop has to move from one end to the other end, maybe perhaps form hydrogen bond with the substrate. So this marginal stability of the globular proteins allow that movement to happen. Without that, if proteins were frozen, they will not function well. So that's important. Non-covalent forces, four weak non-covalent forces are listed here. Hydrogen bonds, hydrophobic interactions. Hydrophobic interactions are crucial for protein folding. Many of the proteins that when they come out of the ribosome, basically it's the hydrophobic interactions of certain residues that starts the process of protein folding. And the third one is ionic interactions, for example, between a protonated lysine and a carboxylate of an aspartate group. They can also facilitate protein folding. So those will be an example of ionic interactions. We talked about hydrogen bond interactions already in the previous class. And of course, ubiquitously present van der Waal interactions. So typically in terms of energetics, these are their approximate energy contribution. So van der Waals can contribute anywhere between 0.1 to 4 kilojoule per mole of energy. Hydrogen bonds can do anywhere from 5 to 30 kilojoule per mole. Obviously, if you have hydrogen bond donors and acceptor atom is in a linear fashion, then you might have a very strong and short hydrogen bond that could contribute to as high as 30 kilojoule per mole. If they are not all in the same line, then maybe it will be a weak hydrogen bonds. Ionic bonds are next. They can contribute anywhere between 20 kilojoule or less. And hydrophobic interactions can be anywhere less than 40 kilojoule per mole. So those are the 4 non-covalent interactions that stabilize the higher levels of protein structures, tertiary and quaternary. So we also talked about peptide bond in our last class. And you know that atoms of the peptide bond, they all lie in the same plane, the 6 participating atoms we talked about in the last class. And you will see in this class that the protein structure overall is based on the arrangements of these amide planes for different amino acids in the protein. And that's that plane of the amide bond happens because, as we showed you before, there is a resonance stabilization energy of the amide bond, which is in the amount of about 88 kilojoule per mole. So amide bonds don't freely rotate, right? Because of that at room temperature. Now, so what happens as a consequence of planar amide bond, right? Now, this is a busy slide a little bit, but you just pay attention to what I am trying to describe you here. It turns out that, this is a peptide bond you can see, right? You can see each of the peptide bond is represented by a plane that is shaded in the blue, light blue, right? And so, and you can see 6 participating atoms that are in the same plane as well, right? So this is, imagine that on the left-hand side is the amino terminus as written here, and the C terminus is the carboxy terminus. And let's focus our attention to this box that is here in the red, okay? And so if you look here at C alpha, for example, sequential C alpha, okay? So one will be here on the left and the other one will be here on the right. So, but I just want to mention here that if anything, if you lose my voice or anything, you can come back, unmute your mic and let me know, okay? So I don't go through the same process that this other poor professor went through. So you can see here that the sequential alpha carbons of 2 amino acids are shown here in this gray, right? And they are separated by 3 bonds right there. 1, 2, 3. And if you look there, you will see that C alpha and the C bond. So C is this carbonyl carbon, okay? That C alpha C bond is a single bond, okay? And then the C alpha, this C alpha and this N amide nitrogen N bond is the other single bond, okay? So they are represented by what we call two dihedral angles called phi and psi. So C alpha C angle is called psi, and C alpha N angle is called phi. C alpha C psi, CCC. Okay, that's how you can memorize. And then C alpha N is the phi angle. Now, what I want you to know is that that is a single bond, and you know that single bond have a free degree of rotation. Okay. Again, of course, it will depend on the R group and all that, and what other surrounding residues are in a protein. But imagine that we are just talking about pure polypeptide here, which doesn't have any kind of secondary structure. So C alpha, see this, so the psi and phi angles literally can, that whole thing can rotate from 0 degree all the way to 360 degree, going one circle. Okay. And so those are dihedral angles that can actually determine how the individual peptide planes are arranged in a protein structure because of those 2 degrees of freedom. That is the key. Okay, you'll notice that the C and N bonds, that's partial double bond, that will not rotate, and that's why you have, you know, that plane. But C alpha C and C alpha N can rotate. Rotation angle could be, dihedral angle could be 0 to 0, 90, you keep going, 180 to 70 or 360, or some people call it 0, then 180, and the other side of the angle they call it negative. Okay, so it will be, let's say, plus 60 will be this angle, right? And the minus 60 will be on the opposite side. But I'll show you more example of that so it becomes more clear. Okay, so this is very important. This is what actually determines the overall fold of a protein. So you have 2 degrees of freedom per residue for the peptide chain. Okay, and so if you look here, for example, this C alpha on the left hand side of the box, you will see that it has 2 degrees of rotation, one determined by the psi and the other one determined by the phi, neighboring phi. So that's what it means when I say 2 degrees of freedom per residue for of the peptide chain. And it turns out that you can trace the entire path of the peptide backbone if you know the psi and phi angles for every one of these residues on the entire protein. It also turns out that only certain values of psi and phi are more likely to occur than others. And I will show you by this example. If you look here, let's look at right here on the left-hand side structure. So you can see that I'm showing you C alpha, which has an R group. That amino acid has whatever R group shown here in yellow. And this is where they are showing you a phi of 0. Okay, so phi of 0 is, you can see that C alpha N bond is 0. It's in eclipsed conformation. Remember your eclipsed and staggered conformation of butane? Same concept here. When the C alpha N bond is 0, right? And C alpha C bond right here is 180. You can see that NH is pointing on the other direction. Okay, so that's the 180 degree of C alpha C right there. Then what you will see is that the 2 oxygen atoms of the 2 neighboring carbonyl, right? Their non-bonded contact radius becomes smaller than the sum of their van der Waals radii. Okay, so they are literally bumping into each other, steric clashes of the electronic clouds of both of these oxygen atoms. So obviously, you know that conformation will not be favorable. And indeed, you do not see any protein which will have a phi of 0 and psi of 180 degree for any of the amino acid residue in the entire protein. So far, nobody has seen that. And that's because of this. Now, if you did the same exercise and you did a phi of 180 and psi of 0, so you basically have flipped, right? you will see that in that case, the amide nitrogens will be bumping into each other. They will be in the steric clash. Okay, so their non-bonded contact radius will be lower than the sum of their van der Waals radius. So that means electronic clouds are clashing into each other, negatively charged, no good. So that conformation will not work. All you do is that if you actually are able to rotate the phi, of about 120 degree. So from 180, you do a rotation of 120 degree. In that case, your phi angle will be minus 60. So remember, minus 60 will be on one side, and minus 60 will be just on the other side with the same amount of angle. So that's what is shown here. They're showing you the rotation of phi right here with this angle. If you do that, then the bulky carbonyl group is able to go as far as possible from the side chains, and there is no steric clashes between the two carbonyl oxygens or two amide hydrogens. So that conformation is possible. So a phi of minus 60 and psi of 180 is a possible combination value in any protein. Again, if you did this phi of 0 and psi of 0, you will see that the carbonyl oxygen and amide protons will bump into each other dramatically, and that's forbidden because of steric crowding. So it was, there was a lot of cool research being done, in 1940s to 1960s in structural biochemistry. And of course, Pauling's description of alpha helical structure, and Watson and Crick's discovery of double helical structure of DNA and all that. They, both Pauling and Watson and Crick, they won Nobel Prize. But there was a scientist who was from Indian origin, G.N. Ramachandran, who was working for Linus Pauling. And he came up with this very, very interesting hypothesis. And he was the first one to suggest that you can actually take the structure of a protein and literally walk on the amide backbone, okay, and try to measure the phi and psi angle for each one of the amino acids of the protein. And he was able to hypothesize that only certain combinations of these phi and psi values are theoretically possible, okay? And these sterically favorable combinations of phi and psi angles actually are the basis for forming preferred secondary structures and tertiary structures. So what he did was he basically, plotted the psi and phi angles of every amino acid in a protein. And if you were to do that also and just measure phi and psi, you will see, first thing you will notice is that you can see on the y-axis is the psi angle, right? It goes from 0 to plus 180 on the one side, and on the other side 0 to minus 180. This minus 180 and plus 180 are very close to each other, if you know what I mean, right? You remember staggered and eclipsed conformation of butane? Yeah. And same goes for phi angle, right? So if you actually plotted psi and phi angles of individual amino acids, you will see that they all fall in a very certain fixed regions. And those are shown here in the light blue, very light blue and dark blue, okay? So it basically, tells you where the structures typically, secondary structures fall. Right-handed alpha helical structures, they all fall in this range of psi and phi angle, okay? The beta sheets, I know that I have not discussed with you alpha helix, beta sheets, any forms of secondary structures, which I am going to discuss in the coming slides. But for now, you just focus your attention on this psi and phi angle. Parallel beta sheets and anti-parallel beta sheets, both of them fall in this region of psi and phi angle. Okay. We'll talk about the structure of collagen triple helix, a very unique looking structure that falls in the psi phi around here. Okay. Left-handed alpha helix, which is rarely happens in nature, but it does happen, has a psi and phi angle of this. And I will tell you what right-handed alpha helix looks like and left-handed alpha helix looks like in the coming slides. So just be patient. But one of the most important things you will notice here is that most of the part, you see 4 quadrants, only about 25% of the area represents the allowed conformations of a polypeptide chain, as shown here in this blue, different shades of blue. And that's very, very important. Okay. So that's pretty cool. So, you know, nobody has seen, for example, any psi phi angle for any amino acid in any protein structures they have designed, which lies in this quadrant, for example, pretty much, or this one, other than a left-handed alpha helix. So you can actually verify this. This is actually an enzyme called pyruvate kinase. Pyruvate kinase is a glycolytic enzyme that we will talk about in our class. It basically converts phosphoenol pyruvate to pyruvate, okay, and plays a very, very important role in regulating the flux of a very key intermediate, a key molecule called fructose 1,6 bisphosphate to pyruvate. Okay, so but we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But this is just an example. Okay, they took, if you went to PDB data bank, right, and you took the structure of pyruvate kinase, and you started measuring their phi and psi angles of each amino acids of this enzyme, you will see that they will all fall in this range as shown here by the dots. Okay, and some you know, this is all except glycine residue. Glycine actually doesn't follow. You know why? Because glycine is a special amino acid, right? It doesn't have it has only it has a side chain of hydrogen atom. It really doesn't have a side chain, strictly speaking, right? So it's very flexible, and that's why glycine usually doesn't follow Ramachandran plot, psi and phi angle, but most of the other residues do, as shown here. Okay, they all fall in those regions. Okay, so that's the introduction to psi and phi angle, walking on the backbone, trying to determine the structure of a protein, secondary structure, for example. Now let's talk about the first form of secondary structure, which is alpha helix. Okay. If you look here on the left-hand side, of course, this was proposed by no other than Linus Pauling and Bob Corey in 1951. The structure of alpha helix is shown here on the left-hand side, extreme left. You know, it's like your slingy that you have, you know, may have played during your childhood. Just stretch the slingy and that forms an alpha helical structure. Stretch some more, then still maybe alpha helical. Keep stretching and you might see that it may form some other form of secondary structures like beta sheets. I can show you a little bit later on. But here you can see a helix right here. You know, if you look at the dark, light gray structure, that's the backbone they are tracing for this structure. Okay. The side chains are represented by the R group, which are in purple here. Nitrogen is shown by the blue. Oxygen molecules are shown here in the red. This is why I always tell my students to pay close attention to figures, because they tell you a lot if you actually pay close attention. So typical alpha helical structure is stabilized by intra-chain hydrogen bonds. And you can see those hydrogen bond forming between the nitrogen, for example, here, nitrogen, amide nitrogen proton and carbonyl of carbon. Okay, so you can see this dashed light blue lines. Those are all hydrogen bond, and they are intra-chain hydrogen bond. They typically form between the carbonyl group of, let's say, amino acid number 1 and the one that is 4 amino acid away. So that will be NH group of amino acid number 5. So if you look at the structure a little more, you will see that, if you are sitting on this face of the helix, let's say you just stand there and stare at that. And then you move your eyes through the backbone going up here, and then you go and stand next to this. So you are in the same phase, okay? Helix went away from you, but then came back at you. So you are in the same phase. And so if you were to measure a distance, what we call pitch for this helix, the pitch of the helix is, the distance is 5.4 angstrom. That is what is shown here. And if you were to measure how many residues were there in this distance, how many residues were packed, there are an average of 3.6 residues being packed in a distance of 5.4 angstrom. Okay, this is average 3.6. Okay, it's just, this is a standard alpha helical structure in protein. The pitch will be 5.4 angstrom, and there will be an average of 3.6 residues packed between that distance. So if somebody asks you what is the rise for this alpha helix per residue, all you do is you divide 5.4 angstrom by 3.6, right? You divide 5.34 angstrom by 3.6, and that will give you a number which is 1.5 angstrom. So for a standard alpha helix, the rise per residue is 1.5 angstrom. And this becomes a larger number as you actually go to beta sheets, as I will show you later on. Okay, so that's about alpha helix, right? If you actually used a simple, ball and stick model, you will see, you look down, you will see that, oh, looks like there is space between them. But no, if you actually use the space filling model, you don't see any space in the middle, which means actually if you really use the model where each atom represented the covalent radii of the atom, then you will really not see any distance. It is not hollow in the middle, as shown here in B. And D is just showing you that you can actually project the alpha helical structure using this kind of diagram. Okay, so if amino terminus is protonated, that's residue number 1, 2, 3, 4, and keep going down. You can see here 2, 3, 6 could be, the residues that are maybe hydrophobic in nature. And so many times you have proteins that are membrane proteins, and membranes are very hydrophobic. And one way these proteins exist in the membrane could be that there are multiple alpha helix that are actually interacting with each other. So you can imagine that there might be a neighboring alpha helical structure that also may have similar hydrophobic group as shown here in 2, 3, and 6. And there could be hydrophobic interactions between those two helices. Okay. So scientists, and you might have questions. Professor Kumar, can you tell me, if I want to design this peptide, but I want it to make I want this peptide to adopt alpha helical structure in this pH, or at this pH, in this buffer, whatever, right? So, so I can refer you to this table, for example. I will say, look, if you really want to, make an alpha helix, definitely don't go with proline as one of the residue in your alpha helix. Okay, that's what is shown here. In this table, you are seeing a very nice data published in this nice journal Science, where they were able to measure the propensity of individual amino acids to take up the alpha helical conformation. Obviously, they have measured this propensity in the form of free energy, delta delta G. From your learning that if delta delta G or free energy is negative, then the process is favorable. If it's positive number, the process is unfavorable thermodynamically, right? So obviously, if in this table you look and you see that you have all positive numbers, that means it reflects the degree of unfavorability of those individual amino acids. And the way they generated this table is that they actually normalized with respect to alanine, okay, the value of delta G with respect to alanine. It turns out that alanine is one of the amino acid that has the highest tendency to form alpha helix. Okay, so they call that as 0. And rest of the amino acids had less and less propensity to form alpha helix. And you can see that that's why their numbers are positive in nature. But if you glare at this table, you will see the 2 amino acids that are most horrible for forming alpha helical structures are proline and glycine. Glycine is, is too flexible. There is no side chain other than a hydrogen atom. And the proline has a very unique cyclic structure. It has an imino nitrogen that is part of the cyclic structure. So it has a very restricted degree of freedom. So because of that, it is usually not found in standard alpha helical conformation. Very cool, right? Okay, so I told you that I will show you what a left-handed helix looks like, and this is how you represent. You take your left hand and you make your fist like this, and the direction of the thumb represent the direction of the alpha helical structure, going, let's say, from N terminus from the bottom to C terminus on the top. Okay, so and then the fingers, the 4 fingers that you are seeing, is the direction of the helical structure. So you can see it's going like this, right? Right-handed helix, which are most common in nature, are like this. They basically go like this and they wrap around like this, going here. So this is the left-handed helix and right-handed helix, right? Kind of, you can see enantiomorphs, mirror images of each other. Yeah. It turns out that helix has also a very unique property. Okay, helix has a dipole. Helix has a dipole moment. Okay, and here you are seeing a carboxy terminus and the amino terminus on the top, carboxy terminus on the bottom. And you are seeing that they are showing you hydrogen bond interactions between the carbonyl oxygen and the amide proton, right? And so why does alpha helix has a dipole? It's because each peptide bond, if you think about it, is a small dipole, right? There is a positive end and there is a negative end. And when you have a helix, all peptide units like amino acids are aligned in the same orientation along the alpha helical axis, let's say going through the center, right? So all dipoles, individual dipoles are actually aligned with the helix. What does that mean? Is that all carbonyl groups are in the same directions and all amide groups are in the same directions, but in the pointing towards the opposite way. Okay, so because of that, helix has a dipole, and that plays a very, very important role in protein biochemistry, structural biochemistry, how helix, align themselves in the form of tertiary structures. That's cool, right? Now let's talk about the second types of secondary structure, which is beta pleated sheet. What is beta pleated sheets? Beta pleated sheets are secondary other type of secondary structures where you have a more extended structure than alpha helix. Remember I said 1.5 residue per turn, angstrom per turn per residue. This one has 3.5 or 3.25 angstrom per residue. So it's also, this secondary structure was also postulated by Pauling and Corey, again around the same time as alpha helix. The rise per residues are 3.5 angstrom for the anti-parallel strands, and I will show you what that means, and 3.25 angstrom for parallel strand. Okay. And so let's look at the structure, and then everything becomes a little more clear. Okay. Now here in this figure, I am showing you beta conformation of a polypeptide chain that is in the anti-parallel geometry. Okay. So here the structure on the top, you're basically looking at the beta sheet structure, anti-parallel structure from the top. Okay, just you're looking down. Before you starts to look anywhere else, let me focus your attention here. Okay, this is the N-terminus residue on the left-hand side on the top here. You can see they're showing you nitrogen. Okay. On the right-hand side on the top strand, you see carbonyl. So N-terminus from the left going to C-terminus on the right on the top strand. So you can see here goes up, down, right? Then up, down. So you can see here that it goes, and then in a structure, you can see the black arrow. At some point, this chain may decide to come back, just wanders around and then comes back and forms this hydrogen bonded network where you see hydrogen bonds forming between the carbonyl oxygen of the second strand and amide protons from the first strand from the top, right? It forms hydrogen bond interactions, and that interactions will keep these two strands together in this. And then it can go and turn around again, come back again. So you can see that the top strand goes one way, and below that in the middle strand comes back. So that's why anti-parallel. And then the third strand at the bottom comes back again. It's going in the opposite direction from the strand that is just above. So this is the anti-parallel beta sheet structure. You can see also, you will notice that the R groups as shown here in purple, they alternate between the top of the plane and bottom of the plane, top of the plane, bottom of the plane, right? So many such kind of structures can come together to form what we call beta pleated sheet structure. Okay. And the rise per residue is 3.4 angstrom in this. So, it's going up, right? And goes down, up and down. And that's the rise, basically the amount of distance it travels per residue is 3.47. Because rise per residue is 3.47 as opposed to 1.5 as we saw in alpha helix, beta sheet structures are more extended than alpha helix structure. Right? Now, you will also notice that anti-parallel beta sheet structures are more stable than the parallel beta sheet structure that I will show you in a minute. And that's because of this. If you look here, you can see that you are forming hydrogen bonded network, right? So it's kind of forming ring-like structure, hydrogen bonded ring-like structures that alternates between 14 atom structure and 10 atom structure. Okay, so if you count all the atoms that are part of this 14 atom hydrogen bonded structure, you'll see that they are 14 actually. So alternate 14, 10, 14, 10. Okay, that's what you see. Again, you count the number of participating atoms in this 10 ring structure. It's actually not a formal ring structure. But if you are considering that hydrogen bond as a bond, then you can consider that's kind of a pseudo ring structure. And this one is a 14 carbon pseudo ring structure. So that's 14, 10, 14, 10. But more importantly, what you will notice is that in anti-parallel structures, the three participating atoms in the hydrogen bonding are almost near linear. Okay, so this carbonyl oxygen, that hydrogen from the nitrogen, and that nitrogen, they are in the same line, and therefore they form shorter and stronger hydrogen bonds in both cases. Okay, whether they are part of the 14-member ring or 10-member ring. So those two parameters allows the anti-parallel beta sheets to be a little more stable than the parallel beta sheet structure. Okay, if you look at the parallel beta sheets, again, N terminus on the top left, C terminus on the top right. You can see that chain goes, right? But instead of coming back, right back like this, as you saw, mark your attention here on the blue arrows. Let's say the top strand goes behind this, okay? Behind all the way, and then comes back from the middle, okay? To form again N terminus and C terminus residue. Then goes behind again and comes back again. So you will see that all black arrows are going parallel, and you see that N terminus and C terminus are preserved as you are forming these parallel strands of beta sheets. So this will be an example of parallel beta sheets. And if you notice that each hydrogen bonded ring in the parallel beta sheet has 12 atoms in it. Okay, and you can already see here that the three participating atoms in the hydrogen bonded network are not in the same line. So they form weaker hydrogen bond, and that's why they are less stable. And so rise per residue is about 3.26 angstrom. Okay, so that's what you have in terms of alpha helix and beta sheets. Two very important secondary structures. What about beta turns? That turns allows, for example, this beta strand, one of the strands, to come right back. Okay, so you can imagine that it can actually, this strand can just go and loop and then come back and create anti-parallel beta sheets, right? And it does happen a lot. So you have beta turns, okay, or what we call beta bend or tight turn. There are various names biochemists use. And what beta turns does is it allows the peptide chain to reverse directions. Okay, how do you form beta turns is what I will show you in the next slide. Okay, but one thing you will notice is that two residues that had the least propensity to form alpha helix, that were proline and glycine, are prevalent in beta turns, are found a lot in beta turns. Okay, and there are two types of beta turns that primarily we will discuss in this class. There are other types of beta turns exist, but not so commonly. Okay, so this is type 1 on the left hand side and type 2 on the right hand side. Okay, and so both type 1 and type 2 turns are found in nature commonly. Okay, but it turns out that a type 1 turns occurs twice more frequently than the type 2 turn. Okay, so nature somehow preferred type 1 turn twofold to type 2. Other thing to notice is that in type 1 turn, you have the second residue is the proline residue. Okay, and in type 2, you have the third residue as the glycine residue. Often. I am showing you the chemical structure of proline. You can see the imino-nitrogen that is part of this cyclic structure of proline, right? And you can imagine that this proline, that could be very beneficial because that nitrogen can allow the peptide amino acid to make a turn because of that constraints that you see generated due to the ring structure. And that really helps out. So that's why proline is the second residue, and it allows the peptide to turn. Okay. you will notice that if this is your first amino acid, second, third, and fourth, right? You will notice is that there is a hydrogen bond between the peptide group of the first. So you can see here carbonyl of the first amino acid and the amide nitrogen of the fourth amino acid. This turn is primarily stabilized by one hydrogen bonding interactions. How cool is that? Right? So that's what you will see. The same thing happens in type 2 turns, except that the glycine is the third residue. So you beta turns are typically a hydrogen bond between the carbonyl residue of, let's say, 1 and the amide nitrogen of fourth residue, which will be 1 plus 3 residue. Okay. There are type 3 turns as well, beta turns, but they're not that common. Now, you may be curious to know, okay, what about gamma turns? Yeah, it turns out that there are gamma turns, and gamma turns are typically comprised of 3 residue turns instead of 4 residue turns here. Okay, so they are comprised of 3 residue turns, which involves the hydrogen bonding between the carbonyl of first residue and the amide nitrogen of the third residue. Okay, that would be an example of gamma turn. Okay, so let's look at the structure of proline some more. This is a really cool amino acid, very unique. Okay, so it turns out that proline has a very restricted phi and psi space, right? You can see that's because the amino nitrogen is part of this 5-membered ring. So if you look at the psi and phi angle of proline, you will see that phi angle is typically restricted to about -60, and phi angles vary, and basically it varies between -45 to +135. Okay, and so proline is a very, very unique residue. If you know that peptide bonds, they mostly exist in the trans forms, right? So to give you an example, what really cis and trans looks like with respect to proline, I am showing you a dipeptide structure which has an amide bond that contains a proline residue. So if you have a trans, you can see that the way dihedral is written, it's your staggered conformation, right? You can see opposite end of this carbon-carbon bond and nitrogen-carbon bond, C alpha, right? When it flips, you can form the cis structure, which shows like this. So if you were to just think about it, look at this slide and imagine that you are making a peptide, which is coming from, let's say, top left corner here, and you want to make a turn. It will make more sense to have this proline in the cis form, because then you can see that when you have the proline in the cis form, you already are engineering in suitable constraints so you can create a turn more easily, right? So it does turn out that if you have peptide bonds between any amino acids other than the proline, okay, take any one of them, more than 99.95% of those amide bonds are in trans configuration. Very, very little, 0.05 are in the cis configuration. At equilibrium, we are talking about, okay? But if you look at the peptide bonds that involved proline, the amino nitrogen of proline, about 6% of those bonds are in cis configurations. And many of the 6% occur at the beta turns. Okay, so as opposed to 0.05% in cis, when you have proline residue, 6% are in cis configurations, and majority of them occur during the beta turn. Okay, so that's something that you might want to remember. I just want to mention in passing here is that um, um, if you have to do this conversion of cis and trans, right? Cis proline to trans proline conversion, isomerization, what you call it. This process is very, very slow. Okay. Because it involves rotation around this partial carbon nitrogen double bond. So half-life is about, I would say, 1 minute to 2 minutes at room temperature. But there is an enzyme called peptidyl prolyl isomerase. Okay, and there are many of them. These enzymes can rapidly facilitate cis-trans isomerization of prolines. Okay, and ensure that whenever the proline has to exist in the cis configuration, it can exist. All right, very cool. With that, let's talk a little bit about techniques. There is a question? No, I think somebody's mic is on. Let's say it will be nice, right, to have an instrument that can tell you. Let's say you came to my lab and you said, you know, Dr. Pathak, I want to synthesize an alpha helical peptide in your lab using solid phase peptide synthesis protocols that we discussed in the last class. And we have all the reagents you need. We have done tons of peptide synthesis in our labs. It's really, really easy to do, okay? So you worked very hard and you were able to, let's say, synthesize a 20 amino acid peptide. And you think, based on your design, that this peptide is going to have an alpha helical structure at this particular pH. So you made your buffer solution and you really want to test your hypothesis if this is an alpha helical peptide. It turns out that there is an instrument that is available in our department. It's called CD, circular dichroism instrument, that you can actually throw your sample and see if it is an alpha helical structure. So what does this instrument do? It turns out that this circular dichroism instrument, CD, it basically measures what we call ellipticity. Okay, delta epsilon here, shown here on the y-axis. What is ellipticity? Okay, so I'll tell you. Remember, there is a lot of chirality, right? And whenever you design your peptide, because each carbon atom is chiral. So what you can do is, it turns out that this instrument can measure, okay? It has a light source. It can measure a difference in the absorption of a left-handed circularly polarized light and right-handed circularly polarized light. Okay, so this instrument can generate both left-handed circularly polarized light and right-handed circularly polarized, and pass both of these lights through the sample, through your sample. And it can measure the difference in absorption. Simple, very simple. And this happens because these molecules contains what we call chromophore, light absorbing groups. These amino acids have light absorbing groups. Okay, so you can measure that delta A and then correlate that difference in absorption to what we measure as ellipticity. Okay, that's what this does. So if your sample look like something like the one that is traced here in the blue, where it starts out with 0, what you do in this instrument is simply scanning. You know, what is the difference of delta A when you are carrying out a scan from 190 nanometers to, let's say, 250 nanometers. And you see what is delta A is, delta epsilon is. It will start out at 0 at 250, but you will see that if you see two minima, one arising at around 225 nanometer, and the second one arising at around 210 nanometer, and then sharply rising at around 190 nanometer, then you can say that yes, you have your structure is alpha helical structure in this solution at that pH. In this experiment, what they have done is that they simply synthesized a polylysine, which means lysine. Okay, and they put that polylysine in one particular pH and measured delta epsilon. Then they changed the pH and measured delta epsilon, and so on. So different pH, it tells you that you can see the structure dramatically changes when you change the pH. So at certain pH, the same sample will contain a trace that looks like the red one here, with only one minima, that is at around 215 nanometer. And there is one minima at 215 nanometer that will suggest that now the polylysine, which used to be alpha helical, as shown here in the blue, at this particular pH, in this particular environment, it is primarily a beta conformation. Okay, so these are diagnostic features that actually give you. So CD spectrum, can for a given protein can provide a rough estimate, right, for the protein that might be made up of, what percentage of the structure is alpha helical and what percentage of structure is beta conformation. It can give you, you'll have to do some math on it, but it can give you that idea very easily. If you took the same polylysine and totally denatured it, you created what we call random coil structure, which means no structure at all. The trace will look like the one shown here in the blue line. Cool. So it actually, you can monitor, let's say, folding of a protein using CD spectroscopy. Folding or unfolding. Okay, with that brief introduction to secondary structures and how you can actually look at the secondary structures, let's just briefly talk about some proteins, certain types of proteins, which we will not be discussing at length beyond this class. But it is worth mentioning them, talking about them in this class, so you have a rather complete understanding of types of proteins that exist in our cells and bodies. And the first class that we are going to talk about is this fibrous protein. Okay, fibrous proteins are typically proteins that are not water friendly. They are typically insoluble in water. Okay, so silk protein will be another example. Okay, and collagen, for example, that will be another example. It will precipitate out. It will form, precipitate through this protein in water. They're only soluble in certain types of, hydrophobic environment. And most of the fibrous proteins are organized, approximately parallel to a single axis. Okay, so one axis, one dimensional, just everything is organized around that axis. They tend to be mechanically strong. So if you need to, create strength, tensile strength between your tissues, these proteins are utilized. And so therefore fibrous protein play a structural role in nature, not so much like enzymes or globular proteins delivering oxygen to tissues and going and doing such functions, but they are primarily utilized for structural role in nature. And three types of proteins that we will discuss are listed here briefly: alpha keratin, beta keratin, and collagen. Collagen is a very unique structure, and you will see that. Very, very cool. It's a triple helical structure. Okay, and you will see how it is different than the standard alpha helical structure. Okay, so alpha helical structures are found in, for example, the protein alpha keratin of hair. You must be hearing a lot of ads. People are selling all kinds of shampoos containing keratin. And that's exactly what they're trying to sell you. They are basically selling you alpha keratin infused shampoos. This protein is found in hair, feathers, and nails. Beta conformation structures are typically found in silk, for example. I'll show you the structure of that. And then, of course, you have a unique structure, which is a triple helical structure of collagen. Okay, and collagen is found in the tendons and bone matrix and your hair, your skin. Excuse me. And this is actually an actual image of collagen as determined by atomic force microscopy. You are looking here, collagen fiber, okay, triple helical fiber. Now let's look at the structure of alpha keratin protein, right? It turns out that the alpha helical protein, it is a bundle of different types of alpha helical structures. Okay, so the very basic unit is shown here on the top. So this is what we call alpha keratin basic structure. This is an elongated alpha helical structure, not standard alpha helix, elongated, with somewhat thicker and thinner thicker elements at the both N terminus and the C terminus. So that's the most basic unit. And two of these helices are they are interwound together in a left helical sense, left-handed sense, okay, to give this two-chain coil structure. And these then combine in high orders to form what we call protofilament structure, shown here in the third from the top. Okay. And about four of these, in this, the most higher order structure that we are showing here, protofibril. Here you have, if you count, you will see that you have about 32 strands of alpha keratinol. They combined in such a way that they form this protofibril intermediate filament. And these actually, again, come together and form, wrap on top of each other to give the, two of them will give the structure of alpha keratin. Two of them, two of them. Now, alpha keratin structure also has disulfide bridges for extra stability, further stability. That's why here proteins are pretty, tough, good mechanical strength. And so this actually is a little useful, and always my students get excited about this. So I always tell a personal story, but I will skip that for now. But when you go to a salon, right, and you want to create a curl, this is what happens, okay? You have all these disulfide bridges between the strands of your hair, right, protein alpha keratin. So typically what they do is they actually throw a water-friendly reducing agent that will reduce this disulfide bond. Remember, we talked about two types of reducing agents in the last class, DTT and beta-mercaptoethanol. Of course, you don't want to use beta-mercaptoethanol. It's organic. You will use water-friendly reducing agents such as maybe DTT. But there are some really non-toxic, human-friendly reducing agents that you can use. And that's what they use. So they break the disulfide bonds between the individual strands, right? You reduce them to sulfhydryl. And they will then use the curl, whatever the roller is, and they will roll your hair in whatever shape you want. And once they roll their hair, they create the curl, then they can actually throw an oxidizing agent again. And what that will do is it will form the disulfide bridge again, like this. But in this case, the disulfide will be formed not the disulfide that existed when there were no curls, but maybe from the neighboring residues. And so this then creates what we call permanent curl that you see. All right, that's good enough. What about beta sheet structures that is commonly found in silk? And you can see this is actually a real image. Okay, the protein fiber fibroin is the protein that has been labeled with fluorescent group, and they are expressing protein. These spiders are actually releasing the protein fibroin from their spinnerets. Okay, so you can see that thing really coming out. This is actual picture, live picture, you can see. So what the structure look like for beta carotene, the fibroin? It turns out that it contains a very unique sequence. Okay. So it contains, first of all, it contains both anti-parallel and parallel arrangements of beta sheets. But importantly, it contains a very unique primary sequence, and that's what is shown here in red. It contains gly, and the second residue is alanine or a serine. Remember, this is very important for you to pay attention. When you see a biochemist writing like this with a dash here, it basically means either alanine or serine. So it's a repeat of this dipeptide, glycine, alanine, or serine, glycine, alanine, or serine. Okay. And so you can see here that, wow, it looks like almost 50% of the residues are glycine here. Yeah. And remaining 50% are either alanine or serine. And there are different types of silk proteins. Okay. So you don't have to go in too much detail. But here is how the sheets look like. You can see here they are trying to show you a three-dimensional structure, so you can get a real perception of how this beta carotene sheets are arranged in space, right? So you can see here that there are two strands they are showing you, right? One in the background on the top, and the one projecting at you. And it's not projecting at you, but one in the front, but it's still in the plane of the paper. Of the slide. And you'll notice here that they are forming hydrogen bond interactions between NH and carbonyl, right? And because they alternate, you will see that all glycines are on one side, and the side chains of alanine or serine residue, whatever they are on the same face. And this allows them to stack nicely one on top of each other. Okay, and so you can imagine that because of hydrophobic interactions, these alanine residues might be happier not exposing themselves to water, and that makes sense to form a pleated sheet-like structure when you have arrangements like this. And that's exactly what happens. All right, what about collagen? Collagen is a triple helix, very, very unique. Okay. And its basic unit, there are 3 alpha helices. Each alpha helix is known as tropocollagen, and 3 of them come together to form this polypeptide chain. And it turns out that it has a very unique amino acid composition that allows this protein to form this unique triple helical structure. And in this unique primary sequence, here is what it looks like. So this is a repeat of this tripeptide residue. Okay, so first residue is glycine. Again, glycine is prevalent. Then you have the second amino acid. When you say a biochemist writing X, it means that you can pretty much put any amino acid there, any of the 20 naturally occurring amino acid. That's what it means, X. So glycine, and then any amino acid, and then the third residue is either a proline or hydroxyproline. And so the proline and hydroxyproline together make at least 30% of the residues. This X can be glycine or can be proline or hydroxyproline. Okay, so that's what X means. So you notice that nearly 1 residue out of 3 is glycine, proline and hydroxyproline contents are very high. How does it help? This unusual amino acid composition is really unsuited for a standard alpha helix or beta sheets. But it turns out that it is ideally suited for the formation of collagen triple helix. And that should make sense to you, right? You saw proline and glycines, they are not really favored, right, in formation of alpha helix. But they are perfectly fine for still forming a helical structure as long as it is like a triple helix of collagen. And if you look at the individual helix, it is much more extended than alpha helical, standard alpha helical structure. Okay, so you have 3 residues per turn. Okay, a rise per residue is about 3 angstrom, not 1.5 angstrom. Remember, you have 3.6 residues per turn in alpha standard alpha helix. Here it's only 3 residues per turn, so it is more extended. Okay, so what the structure looks like. The individual unit of the alpha helical structure is shown here in A. Okay, this is a left-handed helical structure with 3 residues per turn. That's why I've highlighted in red, left-handed helical structure. It's one of the rare ones, right? And so if you generate a space filling model of all 3, okay, so this is the one, and 3 of them come together to form a triple helix of collagen, right? Super helix that is shown here in C. So it turns out that individual ones are left-handed helical structures, but in the super helix structure, triple helix, 3 of these helices shown here in gray, blue, and dark blue, they wrap around one another with a right-handed twist to give you this super helical structure. Okay, and so if you look down on this, along the helical axis, you will notice one very cool thing. Okay, so you can imagine that you have to wrap your hand around your other hand, right? So there has to be some favorable interaction so they can, the side chains are not bumping into each other. So it makes sense for this protein to have lots and lots of glycine, because what you can do is that near where they are making contact with each other, you can pack your glycine residues, which have only hydrogen as the side chain, least sterically hindered. So you see here, they're showing you that glycine is indeed found in the core of this triple helical structure, and they are found at the tight junctions where these 3 chains are in contact. Pretty cool, right? Now that brings me to talking about more fun type of structures, not just these structural proteins that play, mechanical role in our cells and body and tissues. Globular proteins that are there in the cell doing function, interacting with other proteins, providing scaffolding function, enzymatic function, and so on. So it turns out that globular proteins are compact in nature. They literally fold in such a way so that they minimize, so that the hydrophobic residues in the proteins, they minimize their interactions with the surrounding water molecule. Only polar residues, charged residues are on the surface, and rest of the proteins is literally buried inside. And that plays very important role in protein structure. To give you an example, we are taking a protein called human serum albumin, copious amount of serum protein present in your serum, blood plasma. it has 585 residues. Okay, it's 65 kilodalton protein. If you took these amino acid residues and you try to arrange them all of them in beta conformation, right? Beta conformation is more extended than alpha helical structure, right? So let's imagine that you are trying to put them all in beta conformation. Then the protein will look like this. It will be 2000 angstrom long and 5 angstrom wide. Now, if you were to create all of these amino acid residues, 585 of them, into alpha helical structures, then you will be able to make them little more compact, so that the area will be 900 times 11 angstrom. But if the same protein has to fold not in just simple secondary structures like alpha helix or beta sheets, but many of these alpha helical structures and beta helical structures are allowed to come together and form a globular protein, native protein, then the protein becomes a lot more compact, as you see here. Okay, so this gives you an idea how protein folding actually generates this globular protein structure that is much more compact. And an example is shown here. This is the structure of whale myoglobin. We'll talk about function of this again in the next class. But the structure, crystal structure of this was solved earliest, very early days. And you can see that, they're showing you two different types of representation for this protein. This protein structure, the structure of this protein myoglobin is known. You know exactly at the atomic level where there is hydrogen bond between what residues, where there is beta sheets, if there is any beta sheets, where there are alpha helical structures, where there are loops. Look, there are loops are shown here. Remember, we're talking about loops and turns. They may not be beta turns, but they may be loops. So this myoglobin has a heme shown here in the red, and they're showing you just the backbone of this protein in gray. They're not showing you any side chains. And people show that this is what we call ribbon representation. You can represent the same protein. You go to computer and click one button, and suddenly this structure you can convert into what we call surface contour image. Surface contour image, you can see they are actually, they include van der Waals radii of all individual atoms present. So they can actually give you a real feel for where there are grooves and where this heme might be binding. You can literally see in this surface contour diagram that there is a nice binding pocket for this heme protein in this structure, right? You can go to PDB, just type this in Google if you're curious, PDB 1MBO. Boom, it will actually, Google will give you the structure, crystal structure of this protein. You can literally look on your computer screen, even on a very, very old laptop. You can rotate it, you can look at everything. Okay, so I will highly recommend that you do that exercise. Okay, so with that, so we talked about secondary structure, primary structure, secondary structure, tertiary structures of globular protein. Now I'm going to introduce you a concept called motifs. Okay, what is a motif? A motif is a common three-dimensional structure, one shown here, that usually appears in a wide variety of totally different and evolutionary unrelated proteins, for example. So, there could be it has nothing to do with the sequence, but you'll see that this microstructure actually exists in the globular structure of a protein, although sequence really doesn't, fully match. And the simple motif that I am showing you is beta alpha beta loop. And there are many such motifs. So I'm not going to talk about that in great details. And what that is, I want to give you an example. Here is the beta sheet, and then going to alpha helix, and then coming back as a beta turn. So beta, alpha, beta loop. You can see that it allows the peptide to traverse in one direction, then go in the other direction, and then come back in the same direction. Okay. The other interesting motif is this beta barrel motif. This beta barrel motif I'm showing you is from a protein called alpha hemolysin. Alpha hemolysin is a toxin from this bacteria, Staph aureus. You know, it causes infection. I'm sure you have heard about staph infection. Staph actually can generate this toxin, hemolysin. You may have heard this. Sometimes what happens is somebody, you know, let's say lost a limb in the war, and they came back and they actually had to go through amputation, really bad scene. And they were put on antibiotics, and they were supposed to, you know, the wound was supposed to heal. Any bacteria that were growing on the wound were supposed to be cured. And in most cases, it does happen, and everything cures and heals and everything is great. But sometimes what happens is if people are immunocompromised, this bacteria can be, simple bacterial infection can be deadly. Okay. And that can be because this bacteria can produce these toxins. And one such toxin is alpha hemolysin that literally looks like the structure that I'm showing you here, beta barrel structures. You see here, you can literally start, goes, chain extends, goes this way, and then turns around in a tight loop, goes down, then turns around, and literally forms a barrel-like structure. Okay, so this protein, it turns out, hemolysin is a protein that can actually cause lysis of your red blood cells. Okay, and therefore it can cause permanent damage to the cell membrane of your red blood cells. And if red blood cells starts to rupture, you will not be able to deliver hemoglobin to your brain tissues, right? So this is really, that's why septic shocks are deadly by these toxins. And that's why people don't survive. So this is a beta barrel structure I wanted to show you. It literally creates a puncture in the red blood cell because of its unique structure. Now with that, I want to also give you a little bit introduction about how to determine structure of the protein that you might be interested in. It's a very standard step these days. All you do is you clone your genes, or these days you can buy genes from various commercial sources, and you can put them into an expression vector, and that DNA can be put in E. coli bacterial cells, and you can produce your protein in copious amount. And then what you can do is you can make crystals out of that protein. So you simply, you know, make a supersaturated solution, and eventually we keep looking. After a week or two, if you're lucky, you will get crystal of that protein. Okay, so you can take the single crystal and then go and diffract that single crystal using X-ray. Okay, X-ray is a unique ray. You know, its wavelength is 1/100th of a nanometer to 10 nanometers. Okay, it depends. And so you go and basically diffract your crystal using this X-ray, and you generate what we call diffraction pattern as shown here in A. Okay. So once you have this diffraction pattern, you can take this data and you can actually calculate what we call three-dimensional electron density map around individual nucleus of atoms. Okay, so this they're trying to, I believe, determine the structure of myoglobin, the one that we just talked about. And so when you start seeing regions of you know, nice electron density, that typically reveal the location of atomic nucleus for that atom, right? And then you can piece together this information and literally get atomic resolution structure. So that's one way. but X-ray structures are static structures. Okay, you cannot get much understanding of how this protein might be breathing, what residue, what loop might be actually, you cannot use X-ray structure often to study protein dynamics. Okay, so for that, people rely on another structure, which is NMR. NMR is usually done in solution phase. And so you can actually use two-dimensional NMR to determine the three-dimensional structure of a protein. Okay, and NMR structure typically gives you a very good idea about protein dynamics. So typically what you do is, they are showing you here two-dimensional structure. You can see they are showing you chemical shift on one axis here and chemical shifts a proton on the other axis. Okay, so these, if you look here, there is a diagonal here, right? So the diagonal of this two-dimensional NMR spectrum is actually, if you look at the chemical shift, it's the same chemical shift that you will see in the standard one-dimensional proton spectrum. But what they are doing is these off diagonal peaks that you are seeing here, all these dots that you are seeing. These are the signals that typically you generate using NOE, nuclear Oberhauser effect. I'm not going to go in any details. If you want, if you're curious, you can look them up. And so these off diagonal peaks are the most interesting peaks that are generated by the NOE signal. And that NOE signal happens because of the close range interactions of hydrogen atoms that may lie in space close together, but far along the peptide backbone. Okay, and they are showing you here 1 and 2. There are two key interactions they are focusing you on, and they are actually telling you, based on these two-dimensional spectra, you can literally predict that there is an interaction between the heme group shown here and the 3 methyl hydrogens of this protein. Okay, so that's one. I think that's for number 2. And then there is this other blue circles pair is shown for number 1. Basically, you can get solution structure of protein, and that's what they are showing you here. There are, you can see different breathing motion of the protein you can see. If you look here, you can see that this portion of the protein is highly unstable. Maybe it's playing a very important role in binding of oxygen and so on. So this is NMR. Typically what happens, remember I said that when proteins are folding, they try to bury their hydrophobic groups in the core so as to avoid the interactions with water, hydrophobic interactions, hydrophobic aggregation. So sometimes when you want to bury a certain group, hydrophobic group, you may require at least 2 layers of the secondary structures, whether it's alpha helical structures or beta sheet structures. Okay, so sometimes a protein can use this beta alpha beta motif right here, shown here, to bury a functional group inside. So minimum you need 2 layers. That's what people have seen. So with a beta alpha beta loop, you can see that you can generate 2 nice layers that can be utilized to bury a hydrophobic group. I already talked about this. Hemoglobin, right? Myoglobin is one polypeptide unit with one heme binding site. Hemoglobin, on the other hand, has 4 polypeptides, and each of those polypeptides can bind one heme unit, right? I'm showing you in the red here. And hemoglobin functions as tetramer. If you took 3 units apart and you try to use the function of hemoglobin, it will not work. They have to come together and form this quaternary structure, highest order structures, so they can actually do their function, bind 4 molecules of oxygens to 4 of these heme units and deliver them to the tissues. that are actively doing metabolism. So that's what quaternary structures looks like, right? Now, if you, let's say, want to study a protein, right? And you want to figure out, I want to know how stable this protein is, my protein is, compared to another protein that I'm interested in, protein A and B. How do you figure out? Basically, you want to do denaturation experiment. You want to see how easily, one protein denatures compared to the other protein, right? If it takes harsher environment to denature a protein compared to the other protein, that protein might be more stable thermodynamically speaking, right? So people carry out this thermal denaturation experiment all the time to predict protein stability. So what I am showing you here is the 2-protein ribonuclease A in the blue and apomyoglobin, which means myoglobin without heme bound to it, on the B, on the right hand side. On the x-axis, all you are doing is you are raising the temperature and you are measuring certain properties of this protein. It could be absorption of this protein, fluorescence of the tryptophan from the protein, elasticity, or whatever it is on the y-axis. Okay. So you start out with the fully native protein, and as you raise and raise, you see that you basically see a sudden transition. Okay. In each of the two cases, you are seeing that the transition from fully folded to fully unfolded state is quite abrupt. And when you see such kind of plot, that typically tells you that folding process is cooperative. It suggests cooperativity in the folding or unfolding process. And we'll talk about cooperativity some more when we talk about hemoglobin structure. But what you want to know is that interaction between two groups facilitates interactions between two other groups that may be farther apart. That's what cooperativity means. Cooperativity really means that if I actually, made you happy, one of you who is sitting in the front, gave you a chocolate or something, and you are feeling happy, you actually are able to make somebody who's sitting far away from you a little less sad. There is a cooperativity. Systems are connected. That's how you want to, informally look at the cooperativity. So basically, the one signal here is when the protein is fully denatured, right? Extreme right. And on the left extreme, protein is fully in the native state. You will see that TM is what? It's called melting temperature. Okay, midpoint of the temperature range over the denaturation is occurring is called the melting temperature, TM. And so TM of ribonuclease A is lower than the TM of apomyoglobin, suggesting that apomyoglobin is more stable than ribonuclease A, right? So that's something, one way to look at protein denaturation. The other way to denature protein is by chemical means, where you can add reagents like guanidinium hydrochloride or urea, 6 molar, 10 molar of these denaturants. I'm showing you the structure of guanidinium hydrochloride here on the bottom right. So that's other way to denature a protein. You can see that as soon as you add 6 molar of guanidinium hydrochloride, your protein goes into random coil structure, totally unfolded state. Cool. So that brings me to give you a very important take-home lesson, and that is that primary sequence has the code for tertiary structure, which means it's the primary sequence. When the nature was evolving these proteins, it actually encoded the structure, tertiary structure, into the primary sequence. And how do you prove that? Scientists have done a beautiful experiment to prove that. Okay, they took a protein called ribonuclease, RNase. Ribonuclease is a type of nuclease that catalyzes the degradation of RNA into smaller components. Okay, it doesn't have, you don't have to know, but that's what it does, catalysis. So if you took a really fully functional ribonuclease in the native state, you will see that it's single polypeptide protein, but it has disulfide bonds between different amino acid residues. For example, between 26 and 84th residue, between 72nd and 65th residue. 4 of these disulfide bridges exist. And that's important for the function of the protein, for the globular structure of the protein, for the tertiary structure of the protein. But let's say you added the reducing agent, mercaptoethanol, and you added the denaturant, urea, 6 mole. What will happen is that you will break the disulfide bond and the protein will fully denature. It will be, in a random coil states. Cool? So what then you can do is that, let's say you are able to experimentally remove both urea, your denaturant, and mercaptoethanol, the reducing agent. You just removed it from the medium. You brought a natural medium, a buffer that has oxygen in it, is a pH 7. You remove all the denaturant and reducing agent. And what you will see is that you are able to form a fully functional native protein, which is catalytically just as active as the one that you started with. And think about the coolness of this experiment, right? You always, the protein, although fully denatured, the 26th cysteine residue goes and finds the 84th cysteine residue and reforms that disulfide bridge. 65th cysteine goes and finds 72nd residues and forms the same disulfide bond. And therefore, you form the same tertiary structure. How cool is that? Think about the beauty of evolution, right? Pretty cool, I think. And so you can always ask this question. So how does protein folds then? I would love to know. How do you go from, let's say, totally unfolded state, random coil states where every single bond has a degree of rotation, free degree of rotation around it. It just can do whatever it wants, crazy. What happens? How does protein folds? And so I always show this very unique slide, which shows you the thermodynamics of protein folding, the process, the free energy funnel of protein folding, as we call it. Okay, so this is the thermodynamics of protein folding represented in the form of a free energy funnel. You can see that it is looking like a funnel. At the top, you have a number of conformation, too many, that has a very high degree of conformational entropy, right? They're all rotating so randomly. There is no way to come to the native state, which is at the bottom here. Note here, on the y-axis, there is energy, right? Higher the energy, the more rotational entropy for the protein, more unstable. When you attain the native structure of the protein, your energy of the protein is low. It's very stable. And that's here when the 100% of the protein is folded, right here at the bottom, right? So in the beginning, you have, lots of states with very high entropy. And then you start to form individual hydrogen bonds. First what happens is that hydrophobic collapse happens, where a bunch of these hydrophobic residues just immediately collapse and go in the center of the protein, and you are somewhere around in the middle. Okay. And then slowly, what happens is that you can start to form the secondary structures, and then you start to form interactions between individual secondary structures, so that you form this overall globular protein, which is the very stable structure. And there are proteins like chaperonins. There are catalysts that can be utilized to rapidly catalyze protein folding process. We will not be talking too much about that in this class, but okay. So this is the molten globule state right here in the middle, right? And then you have the native states. So protein folding that happens, sometimes the protein folded protein can get stuck in what we call local minima structure. And when that happens, you may not form a fully functional proteins. Okay. So it is incredible how evolution has taken care so that most proteins fold into their native structure with either help of a catalyst or on their own. But sometimes nature has not been perfect. Certain proteins have issues. They get trapped into this local minima from which they can never come out and go to the native state. And that's what is shown here. Okay. You can actually use computer simulation. This is a protein called valine. It's a very small protein, 36 amino acid long. You can start out by building this protein in the computer. You can run simulation software and literally allow this protein to fold. And scientists have shown that it can take 1 millisecond of simulation time, which is months of computer time, but you can fold a completely random coil structures into a fold that actually exists in nature. Okay. And so that's pretty cool. You can do computer simulations these days. But I want to spend real last few minutes in talking about this disease. It turns out that certain proteins that when they fold, they are in denatured states. They contain certain numbers of beta sheet structures. Okay, so the intermediate state is molten globule, and they come together eventually to form the native protein. If everything goes well, you can go through this process and you can create native protein. But there are proteins that actually will self-assemble. Molten globule, which is the intermediate state, they will start to self-aggregate. They will start to self-associate, and you may be able, the protein will then form what we call amyloid fibril-like structure, which is basically a plaque-like structures that exist in Alzheimer patients. Okay, that's why they are not able to transmit neurons. Their neurons are not firing and receiving signals. So this is amyloid fibril disease. There are many of them. Type 2 diabetes is there. Alzheimer is one such disease. There are more than 20 serious human diseases that actually exist due to the formation of amyloid fibrils. Nature has not done perfection in terms of folding these proteins. So that's why we have them. Okay. So one protein that I want to talk about is this protein called amyloid beta precursor protein, okay, APP. Okay, amyloid beta precursor protein is a protein that actually is ubiquitously present in most tissues. Okay, it's there, it's a membrane protein. What happens is that when it is present in the native form in the cell, in the membrane, this protein, part of this protein is this what we call amyloid beta peptide, right here, shown here. This is only portion of the protein shown here, which we call APP, amyloid beta peptide. Not APP, but amyloid beta peptide. In the native state, it exists as a alpha helical structure. They are showing you a phenylalanine, okay, that actually really is the one that creates the problem in folding. When it is part of the regular protein, it is alpha helical structure. But sometimes during some physiological processes, this protein is cleaved by dedicated proteases, and then it leaves the membrane environment. Okay, and when it leaves the membrane environment, what happens is it basically forms this an extended 2-layer parallel beta sheet structure. Okay, and this structure is what the cause of this amyloid fibril structure is. You can see that this is like really, these phenylalanine residues are stacking from one strand and they are to the other, right? Hydrophobic aggregation of these phenylalanine structures. This protein is no longer in alpha helical pattern, rather it's forming this amyloid fibril-like structures composed of this extended 2-layer parallel beta sheet structure. And this is what is the cause of slow memory loss in patients. Okay, so this is where I want to end the class. I'm always running a few minutes behind, and I appreciate your patience. We are almost 3 minutes past our time. At this time, I will stop the video, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer.